Hello and namaste. My name is Samir Kalra. I'm the managing director at the Hindu American Foundation. Welcome to another episode of That's So Hindu. Today on the podcast, we're privileged to have back a very special guest with us, Sanjay Lazar. Sanjay is an aviation and regulatory expert who specializes in airplane operations, customer service, regulatory approvals, and developing legal solutions for aviation and aerospace clients. An aviation professional for 38 years and a Harvard Law alumnus and an LLB from Bombay University alumnus, Sanjay is also the author of the best-selling book On Angel's Wings, the story of the Kanishka bombing and his life. He has appeared in numerous media, publications, and speaking events, and we're very honored and privileged to have him here with us today on the podcast. Welcome, Sanjay. Great to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Namaste. And thank you so much, Samir, for having me back again on the podcast. I remember last year I was on with Suhag. So this is a wonderful, development. And yes, thank you for the introduction.
Wonderful. And I think one of the reasons we're having you back, of course, is because we're coming up at the time of this recording on the 40th anniversary of what was, prior to 9/11, the worst single terrorist attack in aviation history using an airplane, where the Air India plane known as Kanishka was bombed and all 329 people died on board. That plane, of course, originated in Canada and was attacked by the Khalistan terrorists from Babbar Khalsa International. And of course, the Khalistan movement, for those that are not aware, is a fringe Sikh extremist movement that seeks to separate the state of Punjab and other territories in India from the rest of the country and create a theocratic state or homeland for Sikhs. Of course, it does not have widespread support either in India or in the diaspora, but they have some of the loudest voices and some of the most violent voices, unfortunately, that are keeping this issue alive and still creating problems in Canada as well as the US and other parts of the diaspora. But Sanjay, the reason that we have you here today with us is that this is not just something that happened in Canadian history, but also something that happened very directly to you, very personal to you, as you are a direct victim of this tragedy, and you lost your own family members in this tragic event. If we can maybe start with you just telling us a little bit about your story and the experience of your family during the Air India bombing in 1985. And then, of course, we can get into kind of where this larger Khalistan movement is today and talk about a few other things. But, as we're coming up on this 40th anniversary, I think it's really important to start with the personal tragedy that many victims like yourself have suffered. So we'd love for you to share your story with us.
Thank you, Samir. Yes. As you know, on the 23rd of June, 1985, the Air India 182 Kanishka was bombed out of the skies just outside of Ireland. And as it was approaching Heathrow, it was about 90 minutes or 80 minutes outside Heathrow, and it went down, brought down by a bomb. I was to be on that flight, ironically. I lost my entire family on that flight, my father, my mother, and my baby sister. I mean, you rewind 12 days before that, 10th of June, 1985. And my 12th class results came out and I'd failed. And my parents wanted to cancel their trip and stay behind. They didn't want to go to Canada. And I told them, they'd, of course, been planning it for a while. My father was operating the flight and he was the in-flight supervisor. And what happened was I knew he was going to meet his cousins in Canada after 25 years. He'd not seen them for 25 years. So I told them, you go, carry on. I will get my papers rechecked and reevaluated, and we'll see how that turns out. They were pretty concerned because, during that time, a lot of my friends had committed suicide during their, for poor marks. And he was worried that I'd get into drugs or alcohol or, because I'd been through all that, as a teenager with a sort of a turbulent past, so to speak. But I somehow convinced them, and they left on the 12th of June, 1985. And less than 10, 11 days later, this happened. So yeah, it orphaned me at the age of 17. And I didn't know what was happening. I rushed off to Ireland to London and then to Ireland to identify and recover the bodies. In fact, when on our way there, when we landed in London and we were in the hotel, there was a bomb scare there. So we had to evacuate that at night. There were two more bomb scares on Air India aircraft on that day. You also know there was another bomb in Narita, also bound for an Air India aircraft, which exploded on the conveyor belt, killing two other Japanese baggage handlers. So it was really one of the first of its kind on Earth. Such a coordinated bombing by a group of militants or terrorists who were operating out of Canada, and to bring the Indian government down to its knees, and that's what was their stated objective. They ended up killing 82 kids who were under the age of 12, babies, 10 and 12-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and totally 331 people died. So yeah, that's how we start off in 1985. I went on to join Air India and got into aviation as a youngster. I had a very turbulent childhood, if you'd say. I've covered that all in detail in my book on Angel's Wings. But I had my home taken away from me. I had legal problems. I had to learn law to start fighting these cases, and then I sort of continued in Air India, became a trade union leader, and just kept growing as it went on. Throughout this period, however, we were concerned that there was no movement in Canada or anywhere else in the world to investigate and bring to justice these people. Now, for that, I'll just take you back to 1985 itself, Samir, and you'll be surprised to know the Canadian intelligence and the US intelligence had these guys on their radar from November of 1984. They had Canadian intelligence, that's CSIS, had wiretaps on these guys from February or March of 1985. You had RCMP and CSIS monitoring them. You had the FBI who had had really got a mole inside their group. They had recordings. Mr. Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, the late Prime Minister of India, was visiting Washington in June of 1985, 3 weeks before the bombing, to unveil the Festival of India with President Reagan in Washington, D.C. And you had this situation where the RCMP and the Secret Service, US Secret Service, landed up in Vancouver to meet Talvinder Singh Parmar, the mastermind of this bombing, to tell him not to mess around because Rajiv was also a target, and stay clear. And there are surveillance photographs of them. There are recordings. There are notes that the US and the Canadian intelligence officials knew that there was this plot and there was going to be this bombing. The Indian government sent out 37 warnings, written warnings, to all governments really, but Canadians specifically, and pointing out that either Air India or the State Bank of India would be targeted. Please watch this flight. And there was only one flight a week from India to Canada those days. So it wasn't so difficult with the mountain of evidence they had. They had people who came to them and told them, 3 weeks in advance, I was offered $100,000 to carry this. Let's not forget the previous year, you had the World Sikh Organization's plenary session in New York in the Madison Square Garden, where Arjab Singh Bagri is famously, shouted that I will kill 50,000 Hindus. I mean, that recording is in the public domain. It's been released by the courts in Canada. So so there was all this brewing, and yet with so many intelligence agencies, so many warnings, no one bothered, and it really just tore my life apart and tore so many others apart. The 300 plus families that we lost, and it was a shocking thing for me to have gone through.
No, absolutely. And I think, you're talking about the failure, I think, of intelligence to stop this when they had enough information, vetted information from multiple intelligence agencies, from multiple governments to be able to do something about it. And so I think that's one tragedy. I think the second tragedy that is perhaps even worse is that despite knowing all this, all of the evidence, that the trial, the investigation after the attack was bungled. And, to this day, really, there really hasn't been justice that has been served. And I believe only one person was ever convicted. Can you talk a little bit about how, after going through the tragedy of where you lost your family and so many others lost their loved ones, and then to see this public spectacle of a trial or an investigation and not to lead to any justice or closure, what that meant to you and the other families, and perhaps even how that affects you today, 40 years later?
Very correctly put, Samir. It wasn't only the tragedy. Like I said, prior to the bombing, they followed these guys into the forest in Vancouver on an island. They test fired a bomb. These guys thought nothing of it. After the two bombs went off, strangely enough, the clues came from the Japanese investigators. So the Japanese investigators traced parts of the bomb that were embedded in the walls, etc., at the airport. Those transistors matched transistors that were made by a Japanese company but sold only in Vancouver. They tracked all the conspirators down, really. They pieced together the entire thing. But no investigation really started off for the first 10 years. And I remember going on the first anniversary and the fifth anniversary on, speaking at an interview and saying, if this was a plane full of white people, they would have got justice by the third year or fifth year. We are waiting 40 years for justice because it was a plane full of Indian stroke Hindus stroke, brown Canadians. And nobody gave a damn about us. Nobody gave a damn. And that's exactly what happened. The RCMP went about investigating it in such a ham-handed manner. It took, it wasn't until 2000 that they laid charges. That's 15 years after the bombing. And very importantly, there was no protection given to the witnesses who they were talking to, whether CSIS or RCMP or the people that came forward. So one by one, these Khalistanis started knocking off witnesses. So by the time you came to trial, you really had nothing. And I attended the trial. Though I was a young guy, I flew from India up to Vancouver right through the trial to watch how it progressed. The Crown prosecution sent people to India, the prosecutors, to take our inputs. We went through that process and we thought, we had a slam dunk case. And believe me when I say this, in any other country of the world, this case would have been a slam dunk and they would have been clapped in irons for the rest of their life, if not, got the death penalty. But here, I remember going for the verdict and I sat not more than 15 feet across these killers, alleged killers, so to speak, because they were acquitted. They were in glass cages and we were, also behind a glass protective wall. And they were smirking and laughing and as though they knew, because they'd really eliminated the entire thread of witnesses or where they'd given statements. The very statements itself were recanted or people came there and said, we don't know, we forgot. But the fact is, tapes, ironically, the entire lot of audio tapes of the surveillance, of the phone call surveillance from March to June, mysteriously erased by the CSIS of officials. They had transcripts. But if you don't have the underlying recording, you've got nothing. So that was, I felt like if my family had died in June of 1985, they were killed once again the day the verdict came out in 2005. It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. And that ironically was the 20th anniversary of the bombing. And I remember meeting up with the Prime Minister of Canada in Ireland, where we have the main memorial, and also the leader of the opposition, plus the Indian cabinet ministers had come. And I said, our families are tired of waiting for justice. When are you going to give us justice? I think that's when the next year, the Canadians, Stephen Harper became Prime Minister and appointed the Justice John Major inquiry. It was a Crown Commission of Inquiry. And we went, it was not to relook at the criminal aspect, but to look at the entire situation, how, the intelligence was destroyed, how the tapes were destroyed, how everything was ignored because they were Indo-Canadians or Canadian Indians or brown. There were some Americans, there were some Brits, but they were all mostly of Indian origin, and a few French people though. And it was a very interesting. I testified before that. I had individual standing in that John Major inquiry. A lot of our crew, Air India crew and pilots, also got standing as an organization. But the tragic thing was, it was just a set of recommendations. It had no legal binding criminal impact. So we were robbed of an opportunity yet again to hold those who were guilty responsible for that action. And till today, the pain and the problem is for us that there will never be any closure. Of course, Talvinder Singh Parmar, who was the main architect, was caught crossing over from Pakistan into Punjab with his ISI handlers in 1992 and was shot dead by the Punjab police after a gun battle. But the conviction of the conspirators is what matters the most, because it shuts the book then forever on this, and that didn't happen. And I've just had a long, we've done a couple of seminars here in Canada, and that's all the underlying feeling of everybody is that we got robbed, we got cheated, and nobody even considers this crime is as you rightly said, it was until 9/11 the biggest aviation act of terrorism. Frankly, today, even today, it's the largest aviation bombing. If you take placing a bomb on an aircraft, because 9/11 was deadlier and ghastlier, but it was ramming aircrafts into buildings. And I'm surprised and shocked that the world has not reacted or even taken into consideration that we need to find these criminals, whoever they are. If these two are not guilty, then let's find those who are guilty.
Absolutely. And I think veteran Canadian journalist Terry Molesky has written extensively about, what you just highlighted in terms of the trial and the lack of justice and the bungling that was done throughout the process. But you referenced one name, Talvinder Singh Parmar, who was known as the architect of this. What's interesting is that, you still see in Canada today amongst Khalistani supporters and activists, posters, very, very obvious and, conspicuous posters of Parmar at gurdwaras, at parades, at events, political events. And if he didn't have anything to do with this attack, why is he still being lionized? Why is he considered a martyr for just getting gunned down in Indian Punjab like any other Khalistani terrorist? So we see this this narrative where oh no, that is being propagated by the Khalistanis. That first of all, it was a false flag operation by the Indian government itself. And then these people that were allegedly accused of committing the bombing themselves didn't do it. But then on the other hand, we see them lionizing and, considering these people as martyrs. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe just starting out with this whole rhetoric about this being an inside job and a false flag operation, and some of the people that are behind that and pushing that narrative in Canada?
Yes. Very interesting point. In fact, you mentioned Terry, and I was with him the last 2 days in Ottawa because he's a very dear friend. He's become a dear friend because he's been interviewing me for over 39 years, plus guiding me in writing my book. The second book, which I'm writing, is actually to debunk this narrative that it was a false flag operation. So I've taken, we're working together, and we've done the entire thread right from Operation Blue Star right up to today, up to Hardeep Singh Nijjar and today's events. But I'll take you through this, Samir, since you pointed this out pretty succinctly. The World Sikh Organization, which is a banned organization in India and in parts of other parts of the world, did appear before Justice John Major, and the same narrative was the narrative that they touted out in 2005 and 6 and 7. They laid out the same theory that it was a false flag. Indian government did it. The intelligence agencies did it to discredit the Sikhs. And here, sorry, I just interject here. I'd like to make this specific distinction. All Sikhs are not Khalistani. Sikhs are different. These Khalistanis really have no religion. They're just terrorists. It's like calling devout Muslims Islamists. They're not. So let's separate that. The Sikhs are a wonderful people. They've served our nation greatly. They've excelled all over the world. These Khalistanis are rogues. They're crooks. They're terrorists. They're like, whether you call them Islamists or Hamas or any, terrible terrorist organization, they're like that, frankly. So ISIS perhaps. So I want to make that quite, distinct. This was all propagated before Justice John Major. And if I remember from the top of my head, in his report, if you read the executive summary in part 1, Justice John Major talks about, he says, WSO, I wish the World Sikh Organization had spent its time better, had spent its time more wisely, rather than trying to create this narrative around the Indian government having blown up its own plane. Why was the need? Point 2, like you rightly said, if it was an Indian false flag operation, then why is Bagri a hero? Why is Parmar, on your floats? Why is he in the Gurdwaras? Why are you, Malik, Rayat, all of them? Because you made them heroes for the simple reason is they were the ones who allegedly took revenge for your loss, or whether you call it, whether it's the Golden Temple or the massacre in Delhi, the Sikh riots after Indira Gandhi's assassination. It's clearly because they're fully cognizant that it happened at their end. I've dealt with all the little, in my upcoming book, dealt with all the little nuances, that the High Commissioner was to go on the flight. He didn't go on the flight. That XYZ, was telling people don't go on the flight. Actually, it was the Sikhs, the Khalistanis in Gurdwaras who were telling people, Air India mein mat jana. If you look back in history, that's what actually happened. So it's quite another thing. And Terry himself has been on numerous talk shows, on podcasts, as well as on Twitter Spaces to debunk this theory. But I thought it's very important once and for all if we put it down in a book and with facts, figures, statements. I've interviewed almost 200 plus people in the last 4 years to deal with this. But the bigger point that you mentioned, rightly so, is the resurgence of the Khalistani movement. What happened was after 85, they were on the run. And because of the bombing, after 2000, when they got acquitted during the trials, and then 2005-6, John Major's commission came into being. The World Sikh Organization was born, and and came up through the inquiry. And what happened thereafter? Matters died, but it was the last Canadian government with with the NDP and Trudeau in power, which gave rise, which fueled this new Khalistani movement. Today, we see an entirely new generation of youngsters who are propagating this. Now, as an aside, first of all, let's understand, not an inch of Indian territory will ever be ceded to anybody. And I'll tell you, the Sikhs will be the first to fight against anybody trying to take land away from our nation. The second is, this narrative has been shaped very nicely, especially in Canada and North America, about a Hindu versus Sikh war. Really, if you studied, theology and you went into Sikh history, Sikhism is actually an offshoot of Hinduism at some point, at some level. The Sikhs, Guru Nanak Dev and all of, and at one time you had Hindu gods and idols as well at, on within Gurdwaras or outside. The books, the holy books also talk of that. So I don't see them as separate. They want to see them as separate, and they are insurgents. They are people who want to divide society. I do believe that we are one homogeneous society. We should not be doing this, but this is just trying to, you've seen what's happened in the last 6 months, temples being attacked by these Khalistani guys, waving yellow flags. So we know what the current scenario is, and it's being fueled by people who want to brew internal unrest to make political capital out of it. Whether it's in Canada or even in some parts of the US, we've seen that, and that's a tragic thing because they're using all of their influence. Coming to influence, that's something I want to just point out. There's a lot of money that was going into the militant movement in the 80s and the 90s. through the temples and through the gurdwaras really, and they were pumping it back into Pakistan and to the Khalistani camps. Ever since that's been dead, that money is just there to use for organizations that, like the WSO, to fuel insurgency and create trouble, or incite, I'd say, wars between religions, between people, whether it's Muslims, whether it's the Hindu groups. That's all they've been doing. And there's also the drug channels that are coming through Mexico and Colombia right into Vancouver, and they're some of the biggest distributors are these Khalistani guys. So they basically run the entire underworld operations in Canada, and they're growing into a very strong political force now. In the 40 years that I've tracked this movement and seen the people, today every political party has at least 2 or 3 of them at the top levels. So they've inserted themselves extremely well into the upper echelons of the political system. Plus, they've got the muscle and the fight in them. So it's concerning because the world at large, whether in the US, in Canada, in Europe, do not realize that, and I say this with great consideration, Khalistan to me equals Pakistan, because Pakistan is the birthplace of the Khalistani movements. Also equals Islamist terrorism, because whichever terrorist organization you see, they've had their roots being funded and bred within Pakistan to hurt India, or, for example, Islamists to hurt other countries. So this is something that the world needs to stand up and take note of. And it's not something that happened yesterday. I mean, we speak of Hardeep Singh Nijjar's killing was in the news, the plumber from Canada, and I have photographs of him from the Globe and Mail, where he's standing on a rooftop in Islamabad with the other terrorists, holding a gun. What was the plumber doing in Pakistan? He was training. They were training people. So you've got to understand that these are not, kosher individuals. They've got very colorful backgrounds. They are people who inculcate terrorism and breed fear amongst people, the normal citizenry. Therefore, nobody talks about them. And we need to realize that, whether it's Nijjar or whether it's Panun or WSO or SFJ, they're all, two sides of the same coin. And the sooner we learn about it, we would understand. This is not to say all Sikhs are this. There's a huge family of Sikhs who believe in Sikhi, and that's very important. Coming back to India, we've had polls, we've had elections. More than 95, 98% will never have voted that they'd never leave India. So this is all nonsense. It's just to foment anti-Indian or anti-Hindu feeling.
No, absolutely. And you've made a number of great points there. And I think just to support your last point about the lack of support of Sikhs for Khalistan, I think even going further than that, a recent Pew survey in India found that more than 85%, I believe, of Sikhs felt that they were free to, practice their religion in India and felt that they identified as Indian. And this is one of the narratives that you see propagated by Khalistanis in the West, is that they are not Indian. They are a separate people. Punjab has nothing to do with India, etc. And so I think the actual facts, people on the ground in India debunk all these narratives that the Khalistanis are trying to claim, which I think what you said is so important, in that if people knew about what this movement actually stands for, I think they would not be able to have as much success or be able to penetrate the different levels of power that they have. And, we had Michael Rubin, who is a scholar from the American Enterprise Institute and Middle East Forum, on our podcast recently. And he was talking about that exact point, is that both the Americans as well as Europeans and others, if they just knew what this movement was about, that its credibility, it would have a complete lack of support. But it's because people don't understand what this movement stands for, what they've actually done, the violence to terrorism that they have promoted and engaged in. And so I think, that education piece is so important, which kind of brings me back to my next question, which is, I think you have a really inspiring story because you obviously came from, being a victim and going through tragedy to kind of having a successful career to going through the trials. But so much of your life has also been dedicated to raising awareness about the Air India bombing and the broader dangers posed by the Khalistan movement. And you touched on the books that you're writing, but can you talk a little bit more broadly about your efforts to, one, raise awareness about this issue, and number two, really actually counter some of the dangerous narratives that are out there?
Absolutely. Books came very late in my life, but I got in, like I said, I became very active in Air India and in the trade union movement. And what happened then was I got very politically active in India. And I'm not ashamed to say it. I've been with the BJP and, Hindu parties for about 30, 35 plus years because I gravitated towards the theories and the processes that party had, whether it's Vajpayee ji or whoever. So I began to want to correct the narrative that was falsely set out, by the Khalistanis, but also in other aspects, whether, it's not only Khalistani terrorism that we suffer in India, and India suffers some of the worst terrorism in the world. There's also Islamic terror that we face, Islamist terror. So I set out, politically talking a lot. I spoke in various events across India. It slowly grew outside of India. But, I kept getting this nagging feeling in my heart. And I go every year to Ireland, which is where the aircraft went down. And I go to the memorial where where all the families are, immortalized or memorialized. And I got this feeling, this sinking feeling for quite a while that I'd not done enough. So, I remember meditating on the banks of the Atlantic Ocean there a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And touching those waters of the Atlantic Ocean, I felt this feeling within me that my father was telling me I'd not done enough to, really put the story out publicly. And, all the families wanted that heard more. And that's when I started writing that night, and I started writing this book. And now I've written over 250,000 words. So the books are one part. I intend to find, obviously, a producer. We look around the world, and this may seem a little trivial to a lot of people, but not to me. I've been in aviation now 38 plus 2, 40 years, literally. And it's 40 years of the bombing. And rightly, people talk, remember Lockerbie, 9/11, TWA, Korean Airlines, Iran Air. There are a number of, I can name 10 tragedies like this, but nobody talks about Air India. Nobody talks about the Kanishka, except when it comes next to, or close to the anniversary. And it's very important because the Kanishka bombing changed history in such a way, aviation history, because a lot of new rules came into being. And our 331 lives as Indians or as Hindus or as Indo-Canadians or, whatever we were, whatever bracket you want to put, are worth as much as everybody else's lives. I'm not trying to belittle anybody else's tragedy. They're all very great tragedies. For me, the loss of even one human life is a price too high for us to pay. I'm a believer in nonviolence and I practice nonviolence. I do not like war, but if it is thrust on us, we have to accept it. And, like Lord Krishna says, this is your battle. You have to fight it. And, it's such a Lord Krishna and Arjun discourse. So I believe in that. But I also like to propagate anti-terrorism, whether it's in Kashmir, whether it's, in the South. I've done it so far in India. I like to speak and let people realize what the horrors of terrorism are and why, society, modern civilized society cannot accept anybody for any grounds, on any grounds, to allow them to perpetrate terrorism and kill women, children, and even grown-up men. There is no excuse for us, to allow this. It hurts me to see governments allow, type A type of terrorist is okay to me because this is his goal, or type B type of terror. Terrorism is terrorism, and we must have a standard definition for them across the board. Just because a terrorist sits out for 10 years quietly and comes back in does not make him a saint. He's still a terrorist. He may be, in purgatory, or he may be reforming, but he doesn't become, a saint. We need to understand that. The other important aspect is, what is the definition of freedom of speech? Now, I've seen a lot of things that happen in Europe and in North America where somebody says, kill Modi, or kill Indians, or kill, Hindus. That can't be freedom of speech. It could be, I'll break away and create Khalistan, for example. In India, there is a level of freedom of speech, and that the kill and the breakaway is secessionism or threat to murder. In Canada, they allow just about anything. You can say anything to anybody and get away. And in the US, they have, of course, your First Amendment rights. And even so, I do believe we need to draw a line. I'm not saying stop free speech, but you can't propagate the death of somebody or invoke, feelings or enmity between human beings to kill someone. There has to be something, that we draw the line. And that guy can't be a virtuous freedom fighter, so to speak. So, like people very often say, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That can't be the case. When a group of people take down an aircraft full of 331 people, there's no freedom fighter there. They're killers. They're cold-blooded killers. When we look back at the October 7th massacre in Israel, there's no freedom fighter there. They're all murderers. We need to accept that very clearly and base a universal standard of what is terrorism, what is not, what is genocidal, what is, anti in racism, or there's so many little compartments. And we seem to be falling into all these little traps, and we're in 2025 now. We're still doing and making the same mistakes that we were doing in the 80s.
Yeah. And, I think just to your point about the freedom of speech issue, and I'll speak as an American, I think, there's what may be technically protected under the law, and then there's what a society allows to be acceptable speech. Okay. And I think that even if we can argue that, what these Khalistanis are saying when they're advocating violence or being bigoted or anti-Hindu or racist, yes, maybe it's protected under the First Amendment, but it certainly should not be acceptable in society, and they should be marginalized. We should not see elected officials going to their events and publicly, appearing on the stage with them and allowing that speech to occur. I mean, the parallel I would draw is that you are not going to see a parade going through the middle of New York City with floats of Osama bin Laden and people celebrating that and politicians showing up to those events. Yes, maybe you can say it's protected free speech, but it's absolutely not acceptable speech within our civilized society here in America. And I think that's something similar that we can draw that line where, yes, you can say what you want, but that doesn't mean as a society we have to accept it.
I agree with you completely. I mean, you can't have a float with Osama and celebrate him like a Macy's Day Parade. You send out a float of Osama bin Laden, but yet, in Brampton, you would send out a float with Indira Gandhi being gunned down and a plane blowing up, all that sort of stuff. I really don't understand, how we as human, and plus on that same stage, you'd have all the three contenders for the prime minister's post standing up. And of course, they're doing it for the religion. But why are they mixing it with the terrorism? That's my point. By all means, follow Baisakhi and do that. I love that. That's great. But keep this, killing and terrorism out of the picture. That's important. And some of these guys have, I don't want to name names, but some of these Canadian senior politicians have been on the same platform with killers whilst they're propagating killing. And, we've all got recordings of all of them, but then that's the way they will go. So that's another thing, I to spread awareness now. In fact, this trip, I'm traveling through Canada and of course will, come to the US at some point and then go to Europe. But I want to speak about terrorism, and I want to tell people that we need to eschew terrorism and abhor it, with all our mind. And there are right-thinking minded people, whether they're, Sikhs, whether they're Islamists, whether they're Hindus, So there may be fringe elements, on the side who are terrorists, but let's keep them aside and shun them. The more we give them fuel to their rancid thoughts, the more they're going to propagate this nonsense. And we need to keep them aside. We need to understand that the underlying goodness of all these religions is being obscured by this terrorism or racism or the horrors of the vanity of a few people. That's what it is.
And in your travels and in your events and conversations with policymakers, elected officials, let's just say in Canada and the US, do you have a reason for optimism? Do you have a reason that they are slowly maybe understanding this, or that that there will be a turn in terms of how they view Khalistani terrorism and Khalistani extremism going forward?
I wasn't so optimistic until I came here. And I've begun, talking to a few people. I've begun to get optimistic because I do see that they're looking at changing the direction. We can't ignore the fact that India is no longer the country it was 40 years ago. We're a booming economy. We are in the top 4 in the world. We third largest aviation market. We're growing in leaps and bounds. We have a very strong government in place. So I think just as much as India needs these countries, they need to trade with India, and they're also beginning to understand the pulse of the religious feelings as well as the terrorist angle better. And I do believe everyone is making attempts. I do see a lot of I hats off and I laud the Trump administration for having released a very known terrorist very recently, and he got sent off to India, who was involved in the 26/11 and the other. I do hope that more of this happens. I also hope that Canada, sits back and finds a way to, get this Niger story correct, and let's cool our minds. Diplomacy is not about shouting from the rooftops that you did it, he did it, she did it. There are ways and means. It's an established form of government to government interaction dating back 2-3 centuries, 5 centuries even. So we need to be able to understand that. Let's not have immature politicians with hot heads start, muddying the waters, which it has happened in the last 2 years. I do have great sense of optimism. I've spoken to quite a few people in Canada and reaching out to a few people in the US, and I'm pretty hopeful that the 2 or 3 things. One is sidelining Khalistani movement, or the people who are spearheading that should happen, and also that we recognize that Hinduism is one of the largest religions on earth, and you can't just cast them aside just because you've got so many H1Bs or you've got so many computer scientists. They have so much to give to this universe. They've already are we have given so much by way of culture, religion, mathematics, meditation, yoga. I can go on and on about this, but you know better than me. And it's important that you recognize this is not a religion or a preaching of violence. It is a religion and preaching of love, of peace and nobility. The war comes when it's thrust upon you. You don't go looking for it. So this is something that many people fail to understand, what the essence of Indian culture or Hindu culture is. I'm glad that, the current administration in the US is beginning to see the light of that. And hopefully we can all make a great beginning and see, better days in the future. We need to put this behind. I would not want, I was a young kid, orphaned at 17. I had nobody. I would not want anybody else to go in that, to be in that position of any country, any religion, any caste, any creed, leave alone an Indian. So, this is my effort. I'm not a warmonger or a hawk. I'm actually somebody who wants to bring peace everywhere. And, I'd go out and embrace the first guy if he said, he was contrite and wanted to, patch up. My own partner is Sikh, so I don't even look at, it as an inimical or body or a religion. I go to the Gurdwara myself. I go to the temple myself. I practice all religions. I love religion, so I do believe that we all need to look at it differently.
Absolutely. Kind of as we wrap up the podcast, maybe what you can help us from an American perspective understand is, I think what's happening today is a lot of the whole Khalistani rhetoric and groups are hiding behind this narrative now of transnational repression, where the Indian government is going around assassinating, Sikh leaders, not even Khalistanis, but Sikh leaders, and trying to suppress any dissent from the broader Sikh community. And what's getting lost is the danger of these fringe, small group of people, but very violent and very loud group of people. Maybe if you can leave some lessons and why the American people and American policymakers need to pay attention to this issue, and why we need to understand why it's important to counter this type of extremism, and ensure that we don't see another Ganeshka bombing, from America, or we don't see any other type of violence coming out from the Khalistan movement, either on American soil or any other soil.
A very interesting point you brought out there, transnational repression. This is a very interesting contrast, the way Canada dealt with the subject and the way the US dealt with the subject. Now, the US dealt with the subject the way a mature democracy would. And maybe they had back channels, they spoke in the background, they sorted it out. There is an indictment in New York, and the Indian government has cooperated extremely with the US officials. And I do believe that, the process of law will go through. India has already said that it was not anything sanctioned officially by the government, and that person acted alone. I'm sure, if there is to be some reparation or whatever the court orders, will probably be taken through to its fruition. On the other hand, when I look at what Canada did and how they handled it, you naturally had this pushback. I'm not saying that it was true, but I'm saying the proof was never given, the discussion was never had. And I do believe that there is a court case there as well. We'll go through the motions there and see where that release leaves us. But my bigger point is, whoever the persons were the targets, also, whoever has targeted them, whether they're rogue Indian elements or mercenaries or whoever they are, I'm not saying anybody else, they also have very, very strong antecedents, both of them, as being people who are playing this game. And I would like to say this, on the record, but my personal view is Mr. Nijjar was not killed by anybody Indian, from the Indian government. It was a deal gone wrong. The Khalistanis have bred problems within themselves, and I'll wait for the courts to give their verdict on the evidence that comes forth. But transnational repression is, I don't prescribe to violence at all. I've already said that. And I would say, if it is extrajudicial killings, I strongly condemn it. However, I believe there's more than meets the eye. As far as, some of the speeches, some of the threats made, some of the things, I do also believe that it is incumbent on nations to ensure that their soil is not used for threatening friendly nations. You can't sit in Toronto or Ottawa or DC or New York and say, I'm going to blow up the Parliament of India. I'm going to blow up the Indira Gandhi airport. You can't do that. I mean, I'd be arrested if I sat in my country and said, I'm going to blow up, Canadian Parliament. I'd have the cops on me in 15 minutes and they'd pick me up. Maybe it's allowed in this country because your free speech laws are so strong or whatever. But, giving a death threat to somebody else, I feel, needs to be looked at very strongly. And I do believe that, in the end, if things are handled with diplomatic nuances, they will be resolved either way. I don't think nations have to rely on extrajudicial killings when we have robust legal systems. Actually, all three, India, the US, and Canada, have very strong, robust systems, plus democratic institutions. So, and the legal institution is probably the strongest in all these three. So we need to make sure that we use that. and let's hope for the best. And I can see, because India and the US are on extremely strong relations at the moment. I hope the Canadian-Indian relationship develops with this new government that's in place, and they move forward.
Absolutely. And I think we've seen some positive signs already. There was a recent arrest where I'm based in California, Northern California, of a Khalistani terrorist, Harpreet Singh Pasia, who was linked to Babur Khalsa International. So we see some steps being taken, and I hope this continues because, this idea that, as you mentioned, this terrorist movement that has, cost the lives of, 30 to 40,000 people across continents is allowed to operate freely, I think is completely unacceptable, and something needs to be done about that. And obviously, from a perspective of an American, again, this narrative that, it's, transnational repression is the bigger issue, and that's being used to shut down any legitimate criticism of the Khalistan movement, I think is another thing that is hugely problematic. And I think American policymakers, Canadian policymakers need to take these issues seriously. It goes back to the whole Pakistan issue. If you breed the snakes in your backyard and you allow them to grow, they're going to come back to bite you at some point.
I had one quick point there. You spoke of transnational oppression, and you spoke of, the lack of the ability of people to criticize India for Khalistan or whatever. Tell me which of these three countries have terrorists elected to parliament, sitting in jail? Only India. You couldn't even contest for a seat in the United States or Canadian Parliament. But as a terrorist in India, you've got guys who are sitting in jail, but who won elections, been released to come and vote in the Parliament and gone back. So that's how. So it's not that criticism is not allowed. There's a huge amount of criticism permitted, but we draw the line at death threats. We draw the line at terrorism and secessionism. Secessionism is a no-go. I mean, if you tell me tomorrow I'm going to create my own nation in Tamil Nadu or in Maharashtra, that's certainly off the table, because I think the Constitution of India doesn't permit it, the laws don't permit it. But other than that, I think we have a fairly free and strong democracy in India that allows free speech up to death threats. We don't permit it, and allows free thinking and criticism. There is a lot of criticism. At some level, every political organization has its boundaries, but by and large, the courts and the Constitution recognize it. So, I just wanted to sign off and give you that thought as well. But bottom line, I abhor terrorism. I abhor violence, and I do not propagate it. I do believe that there is scope for many of us to lend our voice to positive thoughts about nonviolence and peace, and also, understanding each other's religions is very important. Understanding each other's ways is very important. I may be different from the next guy, down the road. He may be practicing Jew or a Baha'i or, Islamist, anything. But we're different, and we need to understand and respect each other's religions. That's extremely important in this day and age.
Well, thank you so much, Sanjay, for joining us and giving us some of your time today. On our way out, if you can let our audience know how they can follow you on social media or follow your writings, please do.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, and I'm SJLAZAR, Sanjay Lazar. You can find me. I'm also the same handle on LinkedIn, on Instagram. But my books are available on Amazon. In Canada, Amazon in the United States, Amazon in India. Sanjay Lazar, if you just Google or look it up, you'll see On Angel's Wings is there. I've got 3 other books which are not related to bombing or terrorism, but courage and human endeavors. But my second book, The Blood of Angels, which is a categorical history, chronological history of the Khalistani movement, which starts from before Operation Blue Star, comes up to today, should be out by the end of this year. That will also be up on Amazon, so please do that. And if you're in Washington, anytime, I think this will probably be broadcast later. So, but any case, I'll be speaking in Washington as well. And, I'll continue to come and chime in my thoughts on your podcasts for the Hindu American Foundation. I love the work you guys do. I'm in touch with Suhag a lot. Thank you very much. And, let's keep the flag flying.
Absolutely. And we'll definitely be having you back on when your new book is released. I'm looking
Yes.
forward to reading that myself. And it'll be our honor and privilege to have you back. So thank you again so much for joining us. Thank you to all our listeners for tuning in to another episode of That's So Hindu. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jai Shri Krishna. Thank you.
Well, that's it for this episode of That's So Hindu. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it now with someone who you think will like it too. Please also like, follow, and/or subscribe to this show on whatever platform you're listening to it on. You can help ensure that more of these get made by making a donation to HAF at www.hinduamerican.org/donate. Thanks again for listening.